I've always believed that old things carry a soul, a story waiting to be told. But I could have never imagined that the simple, worn-out coat I bought from that dusty little shop would uncover a past I had long forgotten and a terrible truth that had been hidden from everyone.
My name is Evelyn, a woman well past her 70s, living quietly in the little house my late husband left behind, surrounded by memories that never seemed to fade. To escape the chaos of the outside world, I often found myself in that old curiosity shop down the narrow lane, a place filled with the scent of dust and forgotten years. It was on one of those hazy autumn afternoons when, with no real purpose other than to pass the time, and perhaps to brush against a fragment of the past, I pushed open the creaky door once more. That's when my eyes caught sight of it. A navy blue wool coat hanging alone at the back of the shop. The coat looked old, hopelessly out of fashion, yet its fabric was so fine, its stitching so precise, that it was clear it had once belonged to someone of importance, someone who had worn it with care, and perhaps through moments that truly mattered. When I brought it home, intending only to air it out and maybe reattach a few loose buttons, I hung it neatly in my room, and the moment I slipped my hand into its pocket, just idly, to see what time had left behind, I unknowingly took the first step toward the coldest revelation of my life. At first, I expected nothing more than the familiar stale scent of age, perhaps an old handkerchief or a forgotten ticket stub. But then my fingers brushed against something hard and angular, something that didn't belong. It wasn't a scrap of rubbish fused to the lining by time. It felt deliberate, carefully folded, tucked deep inside, as though someone had hidden it in haste, but with the hope it would never be found again. When I drew it out into the light, I found a small yellowed piece of yellowed paper, its edges fragile, its folds nearly disintegrated, sealed by the heavy scent of mothballs. The note trembled between my fingers, as if relieved to finally be freed from years of darkness. A strange ache stirred in my chest. I couldn't help but wonder what hope or despair had placed this note inside that pocket, what tears or smiles it had witnessed. For a fleeting moment, I hesitated, afraid of intruding upon someone else's most private secret. But curiosity won over conscience. With trembling hands, I unfolded the delicate paper, as though opening an ancient treasure map, unaware that the faded words written in tail ink were about to drag me into a past I thought I had long left behind.
When I finally unfolded that trembling piece of paper between my fingers, the handwriting that emerged, elegant yet hurried, carried the desperation of a message cast into the sea from the heart of a storm, a final plea for rescue that might never come. At first, the words meant nothing. They were fragments, a jumble of phrases that seemed senseless. "Please don't forgive him," followed by an address, and beneath it, a date blurred as if smudged by tears. I had stumbled, quite unwillingly, into the shattered moment of a stranger's life. But then my eyes drifted toward the lower corner, where two names, faint and nearly erased by time, clung stubbornly to the page. The moment I read them, I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice, because those names weren't strangers at all. They belonged to the ghosts of my own buried past, the very memories I had locked away in the darkest corners of my mind, never intending to face again. It was impossible. It had to be some cruel trick of coincidence, or perhaps my aging mind playing games with me. Yet there they were, written in faded ink on that forgotten note found inside a secondhand coat. Kenneth, my late husband, and Sarah, the woman he had always introduced as his brother's wife, my supposed sister-in-law, but who, I now realized, had been nothing of the sort. The shock was unbearable. That old dusty coat I had bought from a thrift shop wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a cursed key, unlocking the dark door to a life built on deception. Without knowing it, I had bought my way into a truth my husband had spent a lifetime hiding from me. I don't know how long I sat there in my worn armchair, holding my breath. Time seemed to halt beneath the weight of those two names, Kenneth and Sarah, as if the entire universe had frozen around them. I read the note again and again, desperate to convince myself my eyes were mistaken, but they weren't. The names stared back at me, pale but undeniable. Kenneth, the man with whom I had shared 20 years of my life, believing I knew every corner of his soul. And Sarah, the woman who had always greeted me with polite coldness, who'd drawn invisible lines between us at every family gathering, whose disdain I'd never understood. Now the note whispered a truth more poisonous than betrayal, that the bond between Kenneth and Sarah had not been one of in-laws, but of something far deeper, far darker, and built entirely on lies. Scenes from the past flickered before me. Those hollow dinners, the forced smiles during Christmas visits, the subtle hostility in Sarah's gaze, and as I relived them, I began to feel the rage rise inside me, a raw, choking fury at the realization that my life had been lived inside a grand illusion. Why had my husband hidden his own sister from me under a false name? What secret had bound them so tightly that it demanded an entire life of deceit? That haunting line, "Please don't forgive him," echoed endlessly in my mind. Who had written it? Who was the one beyond forgiveness? Kenneth, who had poisoned my life with lies, or Sarah, whose silence had made her complicit? Was the note a cry for help or a vow of revenge? My eyes fell to the bottom of the paper again, to the hastily scrawled address beneath their names, and in that moment I understood. This was no longer about idle curiosity. Fate, or something darker, had placed this coat in my hands as a summons, a demand that I uncover what Kenneth had buried, that I confront the injustice of a past long concealed. There was no turning back. I knew with a chilling certainty that until I went to that address, until I faced the truth, I would never again know a night of peaceful sleep.
The small piece of paper clenched in my palm was no longer just an old note. It had become something far heavier, a tangible fragment of deceit, the proof of a secret my late husband had buried so skillfully beneath our marriage that it now seemed to weigh a ton in my hand. And as I sat there, realizing that every shared laugh, every tear, every tender moment in this house had been built on a lie, I felt myself sink into a pit of shame and fury. My mind began to piece things together. The icy glances from Sarah, her cold politeness, and the way Kenneth would always defend her, saying, "Oh, Evelyn, she's just peculiar. She's family. Try to get along." Now it all made sense. The woman I had believed to be my sister-in-law had in truth been his own sister, and I, blind and trusting, had played the fool in their long, cruel game. The decision to go to that
address burned like a coal inside me, but along with it came an almost paralyzing fear. I didn't know what I would find behind that door, what sins or secrets from Kenneth's past would come spilling out, and part of me wondered whether it might be easier, kinder even, to stay ignorant, to live out my days inside the comforting fog of not knowing. But then, like a ghostly echo, those words from the note returned to me. Don't forgive him. It wasn't just about me anymore. Whoever had written that note had also been betrayed, had suffered under the same lie. No, I couldn't turn back. If I didn't unearth the truth now, if I didn't drag into the light what Kenneth had taken to his grave, then I'd never find peace, neither for myself nor for the nameless soul who had hidden that note in the coat's pocket. Slowly, I rose to my feet. My legs trembled under the weight of age and revelation alike, yet the fire of anger inside me lent me a strength I thought I'd lost long ago. I would go to that address. I would knock on that door, and I would walk straight into the heart of whatever truth Sarah had guarded, whatever past that cursed coat had carried into my life, no matter the cost. When I stepped outside, the house seemed to mock me. The walls, heavy with memories of Kenneth, seemed to whisper the hollow laughter of all those false years. Every corner felt poisoned by the echoes of his voice. And as I made my way down the street, the burden on my shoulders wasn't just time itself, it was the crushing weight of betrayal. In the taxi, the low hum of the engine filled my ears, but the city beyond the glass had turned strangely silent, distant, as though I were drifting through a dream. All my focus was on that address, scrawled in faded ink, a place I'd never heard of, in a part of the city that felt like another world. With every passing block, my heartbeat grew louder, sharper, as if my chest could no longer contain it. I imagined what I might find there. Sarah herself, waiting behind that door, or only the wreckage she left behind. When we finally turned into that street, it felt as though time had forgotten it. The air was thick with damp and neglect, the smell of rot seeping from the brickwork. Faces that passed by were lined with exhaustion, lives etched deep into their skin. It was a place utterly unlike the tidy, comfortable world Kenneth had built for me, and that only made my curiosity more feverish. Why had their secret been buried here in such a forgotten corner of the city? The firm, hollow tap of my cane on the cobblestones echoed through the empty street. As I walked, each step slower, heavier, until I finally saw the number, the one written on the note. The house stood there, 2 stories high, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust. It looked as though no one had opened them in years, and yet I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the truth I sought was waiting behind that decay. There I was, standing before the door to the greatest lie of my life, and I realized that knocking on it would be the final step in a journey begun by that single note, a journey that might not end in truth at all, but in a new kind of nightmare. Even so, I lifted my trembling hand and struck the cold brass knocker. Once, twice, and the echo of it felt like the sound of a life breaking open. The sound of the brass knocker echoed through the hollow corridors of that old house, a dull, cavernous thud that seemed to wake something ancient from a long slumber. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The silence behind the door was so thick, so absolute, that I began to believe no one lived there at all, that I had followed a phantom, a foolish hope, to this forgotten place. Seconds stretched into minutes. The weight of the moment pressed harder on my chest, and just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a faint, dragging shuffle from the other side. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of someone forcing frail legs across the floor, each step uneven, labored. It was far more terrifying than a simple "who's there?" because it proved
beyond doubt that life, a fragile, suffering kind of life, still lingered within those walls. My heartbeat tried to sync itself to that slow rhythm, but then came another sound, the agonizing scrape of a rusted chain being undone, metal grinding on metal, as though the trembling hands behind it barely had the strength to pull it free. And in that moment, a terrible thought crept into my mind, that what waited for me behind that door was not Sarah, but something much darker, much older than I had imagined. When the door finally opened, it did so with a drawn-out groan, the kind of sound an old coffin lid might make, and I was met, not by light, but by a suffocating blackness. From within it, a pair of pale eyes emerged, wide with terror, staring at me as if I were a ghost risen from the past. They were not Sarah's eyes. The figure standing before me was nothing but skin and bone, wrapped in rags that looked as though they'd been worn for decades. She trembled violently, her face a map of exhaustion and despair. This frail, nameless woman was the first mystery I met on my road to truth, and though the address on the note was correct, everything else was wrong. She was not the woman I'd come to find. She couldn't be. Yet I couldn't bring myself to ask the question burning in my throat. Where is Sarah? My mind seemed to go numb as I took in the sight of her, the hollow cheeks, the vacant eyes that had long surrendered all hope. I had come here full of anger, ready to confront the cold, proud woman who had deceived me for decades. But this creature of misery standing in the doorway had stripped that fury away, leaving only confusion and unease. The air that leaked through the narrow gap in the doorway was thick with damp and decay, making my stomach turn. The old woman, too, seemed to recoil, trembling harder, as though she believed I'd come to collect a debt, or worse, that I was some long-avoided specter returning to claim her. Her fear was so tangible that it made the whole scene almost unbearable. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Williams. I was given this address." I had no idea what effect that name would have or how it might echo in the hollow silence of that house. The change in her face was instant. At the sound of Sarah's name, a shadow crossed her expression. The dull glaze in her eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something like grief wrapped in recognition. She tried to take a step back, but her legs wouldn't support her. Instead, she gripped the doorframe with what little strength she had left, clinging to it as though the world might otherwise collapse. That reaction told me everything. I was in the right place, but speaking the wrong person. And in that moment, I stopped caring about restraint. I reached into my coat pocket and drew out the cursed scrap of paper, holding it out toward her. This note, I found it in an old coat. It has the names Kenneth and Sarah written on it. The woman's face drained of color instantly, as if the blood had been pulled from her veins. Her lips moved, barely forming the words, "the coat." Then her knees buckled, and before I could reach out to catch her, she collapsed to the floor like a marionette whose strings had finally been cut. The woman's frail body collapsed at my feet with that faint whisper, "the coat." And for a moment, the world itself seemed to stop breathing. The sound of my cane clattering to the ground barely registered. Every nerve in my body was frozen in terror as I stared down at what had once been a living being, now lying motionless on the cold, cracked tiles because of me, because of the damned past I had carried to her doorstep. Panic overtook me before thought could form.
Madam, can you hear me, please? I cried, lowering myself painfully toward her. My back screamed with every movement. The absence of my cane, a cruel reminder of age. But all that mattered was whether she was still alive. As I reached her, the door behind her swung open wide, and the house exhaled its darkness into the night. A choking wave of rot, mold, and despair that spilled into the threshold like a physical thing. When my palm brushed her forehead, I recoiled. Her skin was ice, and now, for the first time, I could see her face clearly. A face etched not only by age, but by hunger, sorrow, and the kind of grief that takes decades to carve its way into bone. It wasn't Sarah's face. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a living map of pain, the geography of a life buried alive. Wake up, I begged, shaking her shoulders, my voice echoing helplessly through the narrow hallway. My eyes darted toward the shadows inside the house, searching for help. But what I saw instead froze me where I knelt. The corridor was a tomb. Old newspapers were scattered across the floor. Dishes caked with filth sat stacked in corners, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like funeral veils. Everything inside screamed of abandonment, of years in which time itself had stopped. And then I understood. The coat, that cursed secondhand coat, hadn't just carried a secret, it had carried a cry for help. That note wasn't merely a warning about Kenneth and Sarah. It was the final plea of the coat's former owner. Perhaps even this woman, now lying limp before me. She had tried to reach someone, anyone, and somehow her message had found its way to me. Her colorless face gleamed ghost-like under the pale streetlight spilling through the door. She looked dead already, and I, who had come seeking answers, couldn't allow the only witness to that very truth to die in my arms. Desperate, I looked toward the street for help, hoping for a neighbor, a curtain moving, any sign of life. But the street was empty, utterly lifeless. There was no one. It was just her and me. I had one choice left. Pain shot through my spine as I forced myself upright. I would have to go inside, into that choking darkness, and find water, anything that might revive her. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into the belly of something dead. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, heavy enough to taste. My shoes stuck to the floor, a tacky, sticky film I dared not identify. Cobwebs brushed against my arms like skeletal fingers. The walls were damp, their paint peeling away in thin, curling strips, whispering the house's age in every flake. My trembling hand slid along the wall, searching blindly for a light switch. All I found was grime, years of it, a rough, greasy coating that clung to my fingertips. Gradually, my eyes began to adjust to the murk, revealing that the hallway wasn't merely dirty, it was crowded. Stacks of broken furniture, forgotten boxes, torn clothes, a labyrinth of neglect. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum of someone's suffering. And then something glinted faintly in the dark, a single picture frame hanging crooked on the wall. Its glass was cracked, photo behind it thick with dust. I moved closer, my pulse hammering, my fingers brushing the edge of the frame. And when I wiped away the grime, my blood ran cold. It was Kenneth, smiling that same gentle smile he had worn for 20 years of my life. He looked alive, confident, warm, the man I had buried, the man whose lies I was still unearthing. But beside him stood a woman. Her arm was draped over his shoulder, or had been, but her face, however, was gone. Not faded, not time-worn. It had been scratched out, violently, deliberately, the paper torn and gouged where her features should have been. Someone had erased her. And I suddenly knew that whatever truth waited in that house, it wasn't done with me yet.
The frail body at my feet collapsed like a sack the moment she whispered, "The coat," and a wave of horror so fierce swept through me that I didn't even hear my cane clatter to the floor. My mind froze on the terrible truth. The breathing thing that had only a moment before been alive now lay unconscious on the cold stone because of me, because of the cursed past I had carried to her door. In a panic, I bent over her. "Madam, are you all right?" I shouted. The absence of my cane made my back scream, but my only concern was whether she was still alive. The door behind her had been thrown wide, and the house expelled its darkness into the doorway, a choking miasma of rot, mildew, and long-buried despair. When I pressed my hand to her forehead, chill of it made me recoil. For the first time, I could see her face properly, not simply elderly, but mapped with years of sorrow, hunger, and indescribable pain, every line a scar. As I looked, the distance between this face and Sarah widened until it felt impossible they could be the same person. I shook her shoulders and cried, "Wake up!" Desperation pushed my gaze down the corridor, and what I saw froze me. This place was less a home than a tomb. Old newspapers lay scattered, filthy plates were stacked in corners, cobwebs hung like funeral veils. Everything shouted that life here had ended long ago. Then I understood that the coat I'd bought at the second-hand shop was carrying more than a secret. It carried the cry of this woman, and perhaps of others I'd never known. The note wasn't only a warning about Kenneth and Sarah, it was the last plea of the coat's previous owner, perhaps this very woman at my feet. I could not leave her to die here. I fumbled for help by looking out to the street, praying someone might be watching from a window, but the lane was empty. There was no one. My only option was to go inside, caneless and aching, and try to find water or something to revive her. Stepping over the threshold felt like entering the belly of a corpse. The stench of mold and decay hit me so hard my stomach turned. The floor was tacky beneath my shoes. Cobwebs brushed my arms like skeletal fingers. I groped along the wall for a light switch and found only a crust of grime. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the hallway wasn't just filthy, it was a maze of hoarded junk, broken furniture, boxes, torn clothes. This was not a home, but a mausoleum. A cracked, dust-blurred picture frame caught my eye on the wall. When I wiped away the grime, my blood ran cold. It was Kenneth, smiling in that familiar way he'd smiled for 20 years, and beside him, a woman whose face had been violently erased. Her features were gouged out of the photograph as if someone had taken a sharp implement and removed her identity. At that moment, I realized I was not simply looking at a damaged picture. I was witnessing an act of brutal erasure, a rage that had tried to obliterate a woman's memory, even if I didn't know who she had been. The violence of that action told me it was tied to Kenneth's secret. A choked, painful moan from the woman at my feet pulled me from the frame's grip. I'd been staring, hypnotized, but now I remembered why I was there. While I'd been mesmerized by the photograph, a living person in the house, the only breathing witness, was slipping away in my arms. The hand that had scratched that photo might well have been the same hand that had left this woman where she lay. Putting the photograph aside, I murmured, "Water. I must find a glass of water," and pushed deeper into the dark corridor. A kitchen opened up before me like a disaster zone. Rotten food littered the floor, and a mound of moldy dishes on the worktop suggested that surviving here, let alone cooking, had long been impossible. I reached for the rusty tap and filled the cleanest cracked glass I could find. The water that came out sputtered and ran with a rusty tang. While I debated whether to give this to her, my eyes fell on a dusty pill box on the counter, the same hot medicine Kenneth had taken years ago. That pill box stabbed me more sharply than the photograph. It proved Kenneth hadn't only known this address, he'd been part of this filthy world, perhaps ill here, perhaps leading a second secret life entirely separate from the tidy
tidy home I had known. Clutching the cloudy glass, I realized I wasn't just rushing to save a stranger. I was rushing to the last living witness of my lost 20 years. If this woman wasn't Sarah, who was she? I staggered back down the corridor with the stale water, the pillbox's implications tangling in my head and slowing my feet. Kneeling again, despite the sharp pain in my back, I raised the glass to her cracked lips. As the murky water trickled down her chin, I knew I wasn't only trying to revive her, I wanted answers. The reckoning for the 20 years stolen from me. She must wake and speak and tell me why Kenneth had lived in this hell. Perhaps it was the cold touch of the water, or my frantic whispering. Whatever it was, the woman's paper-thin eyelids fluttered. I realized then I was still holding Kenneth's pillbox, and with a guilty haste, I shoved it into my pocket alongside the cursed note, sensing that this woman knew something about Kenneth's secret, but must not know how much I already knew. When her eyes finally opened, they held not the sharp terror of earlier, but the weary resignation of someone who had fought all her life and finally had no strength left to fight. She looked as if she had spent her entire life waiting for this moment, for someone to uncover the secret, and now she had nothing left to give. Leaning close, I breathed into her pale lips and waited for words. The first ones she uttered were not the answers I had been ready for. Instead, they pushed me into an even deeper mystery. In a rasping voice, she whispered, "The coat, so you finally found it. I always knew Sarah was the one who hung it there."
The frail whisper from the woman, "I always knew Sarah hung it there," exploded through that filthy corridor like a bomb and scattered every coherent thought in my head. So the coat hadn't accidentally ended up in that second-hand shop. It had been placed there deliberately by the cold, distant woman I had known as Sarah, left as if waiting to be discovered, a planted piece of evidence. My mind raced. If Sarah had hung the coat there, did that mean she also wrote the pleading note? The "please don't forgive him"? And who then was the unforgivable person? The woman whose face had been scratched out of the photograph, condemned to live in this hell? Or Kenneth, my husband? Had Sarah been plotting revenge? Or had she sent out a desperate cry for help? Anger flared up inside me again. I threw compassion aside, gripped the bony woman's wrist and hissed, "Tell me, who are you? Why would Sarah hang that coat there? And how do you know my husband, Kenneth?" The tremor in my voice was not fear now, but the desperate fury of a woman who could no longer wait for the truth. Under the weight of my questions, the old woman's pale eyes slid away from my face and fixed on the dark, half-open door deeper in the house. That shadowed room I had earlier seen as nothing more than a blot of black. It was as if every answer I sought, every secret, every lie tying Kenneth, Sarah, and this house together was concentrated in that darkness. She lifted a trembling, bony finger and, gathering what strength she had left, pointed toward the doorway. The one word she managed was, "In there." At that moment I understood. The gouged photograph on the wall, the pillbox in the kitchen, and this woman's ruined life all pointed to whatever waited inside that black room. Perhaps Sarah herself. Perhaps something even worse. The dark room the woman indicated felt to me like the black hole where every evil in this house, every one of my husband's lies, and whatever plans Sarah had converged. Her "in there" reverberated through my mind again and again, and I stood paralyzed with horror at not knowing whether I would find a living person, a long-hidden corpse, or the truth that would shatter my mind. I glanced once more at the helpless shape at my feet. Her awareness was slipping, her eyes closed, and she had no strength left to guide me further. In that instant, I understood the entire burden of uncovering this house's secret had fallen to me.
At the end of the path the note in the coat had set me on, I alone must pry the truth from that darkness. I braced my hands on the grimy plaster and, ignoring the ache in every joint, forced myself up. It felt as if the weight of betrayal had become a physical force trying to pull me down. My cane, left at the threshold, was out of reach, so I had to go into that room unsteady, unsupported, and utterly vulnerable. Each step down the corridor felt like wading through mud. I could see only the narrow seam of darkness at the doorway. My ears strained for the slightest sound, a breath, a cry, a movement. But the only thing that seeped from the room was a heavy, undefinable smell of abandonment, stronger even than the stench in the kitchen. When I reached the threshold, my heart hammered so violently that I had trouble breathing. I placed my trembling hand on the cold wooden door and pushed it slowly, as if I were lifting the lid of a long sealed tomb. The squeal the door made echoed in the deathly silence, and the darkness within seemed to spill into the corridor, inviting me in.
As I was about to push the door open and step into that dark void, a smell hit my face from inside. Far different, far heavier than the damp and refuse of the kitchen or corridor. It wasn't merely mildew or rubbish. It was the choking, nauseating stench of a room that hadn't been aired for years, of someone long bedridden, of utter desolation, proof that whatever waited inside was far more than an inanimate object. When my fingers finally found the cold electric switch and I pressed it, the weak bulb in the ceiling flickered and reluctantly lit the room. The sight stole my breath. This was not a room so much as a grave. Blackened walls from damp, ragged heaps of something on the floor, and in the far corner, on a thin, filthy mattress laid directly on the boards, a human silhouette lay. Under that jaundiced light, the thing on the bed looked like nothing but a body wrapped in a dirty blanket. A skeleton of a human so still and silent that for a moment I wondered if the woman at the door had meant to point me to a corpse, and that I was standing before the wreckage of my husband's secret. My hesitant step toward the room stirred the litter on the floor with a whisper. Summoning my courage, I edged closer to the mattress, which showed beneath the blanket a face framed by matted hair and caked with dirt. Sunken cheekbones took me a few seconds to recognize. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. The gaunt, wasted figure on that filthy pallet, the shell of a human so drained of life she was barely recognizable, was Sarah herself, the very sister-in-law I had known for years as cold and proud. And in that instant, I realized the woman who had collapsed at the door was not a victim of circumstances, but Sarah's captor, the one who had locked her in this room and left her to die. The coat placed in the shop had been Sarah's own final, desperate act. As my eyes fixed on the ruined face of Sarah, the truth refused to fit in my mind. The proud, upright woman who had always looked down on me could not possibly be this emaciated ghost. She looked as if she had been dragged out of some wartime camp.
skin and bone clinging to the last shreds of life, and the fact that she was Sarah overturned everything I thought I knew about her. Scanning the room with more focus, the picture became even more dreadful. Empty pill boxes scattered on the floor, dried food remnants, and a window hastily shuttered as if to block even the weak light from outside. This was not a sick room. It was a prison where Sarah had been slowly murdered by neglect. In that moment, the identity of the other woman in the doorway clicked into place like the last piece of a terrible puzzle. She was no helpless victim. She was Sarah's jailer, the one who had locked her away, starved and dehydrated her, and who had fainted when the possibility of the crime being revealed finally arrived at her door. The scrap of paper in my pocket, Sarah's last cry sewn into the coat, the "please don't forgive him," had found its true target. But who was the unforgivable person? The woman at the door who had imprisoned Sarah? Or my husband Kenneth, the smiling man in the photograph and the owner of that pillbox in that filthy kitchen? Had Kenneth known his sister was locked in this room? At that instant, Sarah stirred and let out a thin, pained groan. All my fear and bewilderment turned to an icy rage and an urgent hunger for the truth. I sank down beside the filthy pallet, touched her bony shoulder, and whispered, "Sarah, I'm Evelyn, Kenneth's wife. You must tell me who did this to you." Behind me, I could hear the rustle and stirring of the woman who had fainted at the door beginning to come round.
A rasping rustle came from the corridor as the woman who had fainted slowly came to and tried to pull herself upright. The sound told me cruelly that there was no time to lose. I was locked onto Sarah's last breath in that frozen room because just seconds before that woman at the door could bar me, I had to hear the truth of my husband's dirty secret, to hear Sarah's final whisper. When Sarah's sunken eyes opened at my pleading, "Tell me," she did not look at my face, but at the doorway behind me, at the terror she sensed there. She was so frightened that her emaciated body convulsed on that filthy pallet. And in that instant, I felt down to my marrow how long she had been kept here and by what kind of torture. Leaning close to her cracked lips, I heard the one ragged name she forced out between breaths. Miriam. That name was the key, the missing link connecting the scratched photograph on the wall, the pillbox in the kitchen, and the invisible lock that had kept this body imprisoned. I was frantic to know who Miriam was and what her relationship had been to my husband Kenneth and to Sarah. Knowing I had no more seconds to waste, I gripped Sarah's bony hand in mine and said, "You wrote that note, didn't you? The don't forgive him note? Did you leave the coat in the shop? But why, Kenneth? What did my husband do?" At that, Sarah's gaze slid away from the door's horror and for the first time fixed on me, on the eyes of the woman who had been living a lie beside my husband. Just as Sarah parted her lips to speak the last truth, the yellow light in the room suddenly went out, cut off by a shadow from the corridor. I turned and saw Miriam standing against the door frame, clutching it for support, her eyes alive with pure hatred. And worst of all, my oak cane, the very symbol of my frailty and the support I had relied on for years, was now raised in her hand like a weapon. There, in the threshold, like a specter, Miriam pointed that cane at me. In that moment, I understood the ironies of this house's curse.
past wrongs were not only being revealed now, they were being used against me with my own walking stick. When Miriam spat, "So the filthy thing finally found the coat and brought you here?" The venom she aimed at Sarah made it clear that she was more than a jailer. She was a sadistic guard who had taken pleasure in the cruelty. I felt then that between those two women, I was not merely a witness, but a pawn. A strange, furious strength rose inside me. The afraid, betrayed woman I had been died in that instant. I surprised myself with the steel in my voice as I asked, "Who are you? What part did you play in my husband's secret? And how dare you do this to her, his own sister?" Miriam laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the damp walls. She hissed, "You still think you're his wife? His only family was here. I was his true wife, his cursed sister too. Do you understand? You were just the bit of pretty show outside." Her words hit me as if I'd been struck. The woman who had collapsed at the door was not only the captor, she was Kenneth's hidden wife, and Sarah's supposed sister-in-law was in fact her sister by blood. While I reeled from that monstrous confession, Sarah, with the last of her strength, reached under the filthy pallet and pointed to something hidden there. Miriam saw the movement and flared with fury. She snatched up my cane like an axe and, screaming, "You shall not touch it," bolted toward me with every ounce of force she had left.
As Miriam's furious scream echoed through the room, the heavy oak cane, my own cane, came down on my arm with such force that the pain cut through me like lightning, silencing every other sound. I didn't even hear the cane hit the floor. All I could think was how the very object that had supported me for years had become, in a murderer's hand, a weapon meant to end my life. Writhing on the filthy floor, I saw Miriam lift the cane again, this time aiming for my head. I thought it would all end there, in that reeking, mold-choked room. But at that instant, Sarah, who had been lying motionless on the thin mattress, summoned the last scrap of strength left in her frail body. With a gasp that sounded like a ghost exhaling, she reached out and seized Miriam's wrist with surprising force. The attacker cried out and lost her balance. Sarah's final act of defiance gave me the seconds I needed. Ignoring the stabbing pain in my arm, I dragged myself toward the mattress and reached under it to the spot Sarah had pointed to before. My fingers brushed something cold and rough, a small wooden box, locked and heavy. The moment I pulled it free, Miriam broke from Sarah's grip and hurled herself at me. Suddenly, I was fighting for my life, one hand clutching the box that held my husband's secrets, the other clawing at Miriam's hands as they closed around my throat. The stench, the darkness, the muffled gasps, everything narrowed to the struggle between her will to kill and my need to survive. As her fingers tightened, cutting off my air, my eyes found Sarah again. On her face, amid the ruin of her body, a strange peace was spreading. And then, faintly, as if whispered straight into my mind, came her last confession. The box. It's not Kenneth's. It's mine. The proof of the murder. The words struck like an explosion. The truth tore through me. My husband had not been a liar. He had been the first victim.
The pressure of Miriam's grip was no longer just physical. It was as if I were feeling the same suffocating helplessness Kenneth must have felt when he died. And that instant, I knew I wasn't just fighting for my life, but for his stolen honor and for Sarah's tortured soul. Fueled by that revelation, I gathered every shred of strength left in me and swung the wooden box like a weapon, slamming it against Miriam's temple. The crack of impact echoed in the stale air. Her eyes went wide in stunned disbelief, and then her body went limp, collapsing beside Sarah's still form like a lifeless sack. Gasping, I clutched at my bruised throat and gulped the moldy air as though it were salvation. Propped against the wall, I stared at the tableau before me. Sarah, her face finally calm in death, freed at last from the nightmare, and beside her, the monster who had created it, unconscious and sprawling. There was no time to waste. With trembling hands, I forced the box open, the rusted lock giving way after a brittle protest. Inside, there was no treasure, but only a bundle of yellowed letters, old photographs of Kenneth and Sarah in their youth, and a torn page from a diary in Miriam's handwriting. He spent every penny on that cursed sister. The money was mine. The truth hit me like a hammer. Kenneth hadn't hidden Sarah out of shame. He had hidden her to protect her from Miriam's hatred. The pills I thought were his heart medicine were in fact poison, the slow-acting toxin Miriam had used to kill him. And the coat, that simple, forgotten coat, was Sarah's final message to the world, her desperate attempt to cast the truth out from this prison before she died. Just then, the wail of sirens grew louder outside, proof that our struggle had not been unheard. Blue and red light flashed through the grimy window, painting the room in alternating shades of salvation and damnation. As the beams swept over Miriam's motionless body and Sarah's peaceful face, I sat there on the floor, clutching the letters, the diary page, and the broken box. And I finally understood. What I had uncovered was not a 20-year lie, but a 20-year act of love and sacrifice, buried beneath the ruins of a house built on jealousy, silence, and murder.